Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. If indeed you are, wherever here and or now or then or wherever it is, recording prior to something is a little bit strange to me, even as someone that teaches online quite a lot. But I'm very, very grateful to be here and to be asked to do such a thing. And I'm absolutely delighted to be talking about geomancy at this conference on magic and ecology. Hi, everyone. I'm Al. I have a PhD in early modern history from the University of Bristol. I was very lucky to study under Ronald Hutton on magic, occult philosophy, magical practice, the emotions, medicine, divination, and spellcraft. You can find my website there, and you can drop me a line there. I'm as well as an academic of this material. I'm also a professional geomancer with a professional practice. I see a variety of clients and organizations about a particular series of things. I'm a consultant sorcerer because the Gmail address wasn't taken yet. So this is not just abstract or intellectual for me. This is something that I practice. And I will try and be very clear about when I'm talking about historical practices and when I'm talking about my own, but obviously those are going to come together for some conclusions, hopefully at least. So when I say geomancy, I've noticed people don't always mean what I mean by it. And there are a couple of things that get called geomancy, some systems, some kind of approaches or traditions, some looser than others. So first of all, sometimes people think I mean just like rock magic of various sorts. So some kind of, usually ill-defined prehistoric kind of practice involving petroglyphs, maybe even crystals or something. Other times people think I mean like ley line stuff, miscellanies usually of energetic models and sacred geography lore. Sometimes people even think I mean like land scrying, like divination by topology, like an augury of nature, which to me bears some similarities of the people I know that practice that kind of thing, like year walking or out sitting, as kind of like derive, right? The situations thing. And it's earth mystery stuff. Sometimes people think I mean feng shui, like literal feng shui, and related Taoist and or Chinese magics, right? Which deal with domesticating spheres of the homescape, basically, which is its own landscape. But I don't. I mean Renaissance geomancy, European Renaissance geomancy, which a chart, a shield chart. No one knows why it's called a shield chart. Looks like this. It deals with what gets called computational casting of lots, has its origin in, please forgive my accent, al-Ramal, Arabic sand divination, marking in sand, not casting sand itself. And one of the features that describes geomancy well are these 4-line figures of 1 or 2 dots each line, which produce these 16 different figures. And this is a shield chart, and it gives us 15 different places that are marked with these figures that may tell us about various facets of a situation. So European Renaissance geomancy is kind of a sortilege, mostly. I'll explore that, utilizing the use and rules of astrology applied to these 16 4-line binary figures, right? And by the way, little humble brag here, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, author of the voluminous and encyclopedic 3 books of occult philosophy, called it the most accurate of divination systems. So just saying. All right, so why is it geomancy? There's a bunch of explanations for this. It's done on the earth. You mark in the earth in sand and things like that. But the one I like is Catan's, and it's a translation of geo as earthly, as in worldly. So not just a quarter of the 4 classical elements, just the earth part and not the air, fire, or water. No. The power of superior bodies of the 4 elements of the 7 planets and of the 12 signs of heaven. And I would add the 12 houses of the heavens, which are also incredibly important for geomancy as well. So how do you cast it? Again, I don't want to get too much into how do you do geomancy. I want to get to why I think it's relevant to talk to you all about. Sortilege, ultimately, you can generate an odd or an even number pretty much any way you like. So typically, this will be done by throwing dice. Agrippa lists many polyhedrals that you could use from your Dungeons and Dragons dice for this stuff, and links them to the Platonic solids as well. Interesting. Happy to go over that if anyone wants to talk dice magic. You can also flip a coin, he says, or do a bunch of other things. This is where, say, augury comes in. I know people that divine by which birds are flying left to right, which are flying right to left, right? So 2 that way is a 2, then 1 that way is a 1, right? Etc. You throw or you generate an odd or an even number 4 times, and that gives you your 4 lines of the figure, right? So, there are a bunch of different ways you can do this. You could use other kinds of dice as well. Here are our Rammel dice, right, which have this little spindle through them, and you spin and then set down, and each of them generates half the figures. So here we have 2, 1, 1, 1, which, as we'll recall, is Caput Draconis. All right, so the other thing to bear in mind about this stuff is that you also, one of the techniques, one of the very old techniques of it, is that you put yourself in this prayerful state and you call in spirits to inform you as you're making the marks. And you make the marks yourself and you don't count them while you're doing it. You just pray, you distract yourself. It's a sleight of mind exercise. You don't count them while you're doing it, but then you make the marks and then you count them up to find out whether they're odd or even afterwards. And so the idea here is that it's not entirely just, quote, random numbers. You are generating information from somewhere else. Something is influencing you. We'll talk about that. So what are the uniquely ecological features of geomancy and its magics? It's humoral. It's very humoral. It's very elemental. I would say it's one of the most humoral elemental divination systems I've ever come across, right? It interrelates the human and the environment exceptionally well. It has an inherent dialecticism to it, right? It charts and it mediates interrelations of natural patterns themselves. Finally, it's a dark sister of astrology, or it's the black sheep of the family to some degree. It seems to chart space magic to astrology's time magic. Remember Proclus saying that time is the motion of the celestial bodies. And I also think it has this chthonic element to it that I don't want to say exists instead of, but seems to provide as much focus as emanationist models. So, just like the 12 zodiacal signs can be broken down into elemental triplicities, so the 16 geomantic figures can be broken down into these elemental quartets. There are all sorts of other things we could say about this correspondence stuff, the way that each figure is ruled by a planet, as well as given parallels with a zodiacal sign, and also has an element, right? So these chart a little bit of something of the elements themselves, right? So just like the cardinal fixed and mutable elemental triplicities tell us something about the nature of the elements, so too do these, right? The spark of the fire in Pua, the young boy, the young warrior, the establishment of the fire in Fortuna Major, in the greater fortune, the hard-won success, the spreading and flammability of that fire with the expansiveness of Jupiterian Acquisitio, and finally the ashes and damage that can be left behind by Cauda Draconis, the dragon's tail, that terrible wake. So we're not just using the elements to understand geomancy, we're using geomancy to understand the elements. And ultimately what we're doing when we're tracing how figures relate to each other is we're looking at the elementated world, right, which is made of these compoundings of this dynamic interrelation of elements, right, this transmutation and this union, and not just as Agrippa puts it, heaping them up together, right? This way of tracing the way in which elements interact with each other isn't just something that happens from figure to figure in a chart. It also happens within the figures. So of these 4 lines, each is accorded an elemental identity as well. And so in a feature that seems to have been borrowed in modern practice from the I Ching, many people read these figures now as from a rubric of a single dot meaning an active element present, and 2 dots meaning a passive element present, or I guess element not present, or passively present. And this means we can do some really complicated, what my friend and fellow geomancer Sam Block calls theoretical alchemy with this stuff. And not just, oh, everything's alchemy, like literally looking at how elements turn into other elements, right? And how things constitute, form, stabilize, and decay. And this means we can do all sorts of interesting things with the readings, right? Here's an example from John Michael Greer's study of the figure of Pua, the young warrior that we talked about earlier, who's ruled by Mars, right? And like to Aries and fire, right? These elemental lines, he says, means that we have energy and purpose from that fire. If it's active, if we read it like that, we have ways of interacting intellectually with other people. We have material expression, but we have no receptive inner life. When I did a conference about geomancy at an occult psychiatry conference a couple of years back, that line got an immense laugh. Male sexual energy having no receptive inner life. Imagine that. Potentially, just upset some people, sorry. So we can do all of this interesting psychology stuff with it. And indeed, we can liken it up back, we can link it back up to some real powerful mythic stuff. If we have an active spear of fire, sword of air, and disc or shield of earth, but no cup of water, you know, Greer says this figure is also brings us like Grail mystery stuff. So there's also historiola we can draw from when we're doing these things. Along with each figure having a main element that rules it, being itself made of the interaction of elements, the place, the area in the chart also has an elemental gloss. So say that fiery figure turns up as a, as the second niece, as this 10th place here. It falls in a watery part of the chart. So we have to look at how choleric fiery tendencies are expressed phlegmatically, right? Then each place in a chart also has an elemental identity or proclivity or catalyzing effect. All right. So again, in that 10th place, we now have, for instance, Pua, that fiery figure, in a sanguine place in a phlegmatic area of the chart. And all those layers of elements start to stack to give you a very particular answer. All right. This is what I'm talking about with how humoral it is. Why does this matter? Well, if we're not familiar, humours, yes, they're a balance of the four moistures that correlate or that are corollaries to the classical elements of fire, air, water, and earth. Abundance of one produces a typology which governs not just personality, but the whole body. This is why the two ways we tend to think about humoral theory are either as what one historian of medicine called bad medicine, right? Literally just about the health of the body, or a BuzzFeed personality test, right? That, you know, you're such a Samantha, or you're such a Michelangelo, or you're such a, you know, Velma, right? We can do those with any of these quartets, by the way, and it's a lot of fun to do, and maybe teaches us something about the elements. My point is that this is not just about what something's made of, it's also about how it works and how it interacts with everything else. But yes, it also governs experience and expression of passions and predilections of behavior and cognition. My point would be that it doesn't just work on humans. So we're familiar with this diagram. I hope maybe we are, maybe we're not. If we're not, I can go back to it, but I'm going to kind of skip ahead. But what I want to get at here is that the elements have a cosmology to them, right? Then the humours have cosmology in them. They're not just about the way humans act, they're about the way the world is and how nature do. So why do they matter? Because they're building blocks to the whole cosmos, and we in environment are made of the same fundamental stuff, right? You don't just live in an angry world. If you're angry, you make the world around you angrier as well. There's an interaction going on there. We'll talk more about that. Crucially, in working humours, in charting through divination and remediating also through divination, we are regulating and manipulating the constitutions, not just of people, but of locations, of situations, of conditions and relationships. You can chart the humoral traits, influences, and dynamisms in a place, in a relationship, right? That matters. The end matters. So these treatments, these ways of regulating and manipulating take the form of the non-natural principles, so-called because they're the result of human endeavor. This covers the air and heavens, which is both environmental, like literally the airs of the places you're in, but also covers astrology, the star weather. Also covers real arcane things of embodied practice, like exercise and rest, sleep and wake, food and drink, repletion and excretion, and indeed the passions. So not only does the angry person live in an angry world and make the world angrier, they make themselves easier at getting angry, right? Habituation is a real thing and a real problem. Ultimately, as Nicholas Culpeper says, the two hinges that our model of physics hangs upon are sympathy and antipathy, whether that's using the virtues of the elements, planets, zodiac, or indeed the figures themselves having virtues. This happens through magical prescriptions and indeed proscriptions, like don't do this thing, avoid this thing, this is not going to be useful for you right now. And that can cover actual rituals, that can cover just observances and behavior. Avoid eating too much, you know, spicy food at the moment. You have a lot of this negative martial energy around. You need to be very careful around fire. Or employing talismans. You are at risk of fire, and so here is this protective talisman against fiery things. Those are just examples out of the air. But yes, this is a Saturnine talisman I made for someone. I talked about the dialecticism, and I want to be very clear about that. All right, I don't want to make too much of it, but I think it's worth at least mentioning if you aren't aware. all divination systems seek to take the pieces of fate, right, the lots of fate, and look at how they relate to each other. But to pick an example that most people are familiar with, tarot, you can't literally add tarot cards together, all right? The 3 of Cups and the 6 of Cups don't add together to equal the 9 of Cups necessarily, right? However, with geomancy, that's absolutely the case. There's this, I would argue this empiricism actually, but this, certainly this dialecticism, that you add figures together to produce new figures. Again, odds and evens, right? So we can look at how 2 things interrelate, how they interact, right? This thing and this thing interact in this way. They interact by being added together and producing a 3rd figure, a synthesis, right? So 2 and 2 is even, so will give us an even. 1 and 1 is even, so will give us that. 1 and 2 is odd, 2 and 1 is odd, right? Interestingly, it matters which way around, which is the thesis and which is the antithesis, right? These 2 figures added together will always equal this 3rd figure, right? They just will. That's how the maths of it works. But they're very different answers. This is coming to the crossroads, then experiencing gain, then trying to make a good fortune out of it, right? This is the deal that makes you rich. This is already having gain. This is gain and then having to do a bunch of meetings about it, which is also the greater fortune, but the hard work of the greater fortune. Gain attracts handshakes, more contracts and choices present themselves. It's almost a more money, more problems issue, right? And this matters. Again, it matters. The dialectic of this is that we deal with patterns of nature that will always produce other patterns, right? It's not self-referential in the sense of a tautology, but in the sense of it's internally consistent. And that matters when we're tracing natural processes and our interrelation with those natural processes. So this can be done in a bunch of ways. For instance, we could add, a common one is to produce the sentence, which is adding the figure in the 1st house, vita, which rules, which marks the client or the querent, right? It's what they're about at the moment, what's going on with them, where they are, roughly speaking. Also rules like personality and things like that we can find there. The judgment is the final answer on whatever the question was, right? And so what the sentence traces is the interrelation or the interaction between the client and the answer, right? The answer is revealed, but how you but what the client actually does about that very much depends on how you inform them. So geomancy doesn't just tell you what's going on. It doesn't just tell you what to do about what's going on. It tells you how to tell someone what's going on, what to do about it. If this figure were inverted, this is Laetitia, joy. If it was inverted, it would be Tristitia, sorrow. Clients that are marked with Tristitia in the 1st often will focus only on the negative parts of the reading. And so you have to be very careful about how you read it. This is very useful for understanding that our looking at a problem is also being looked at by the problem and is also affecting the problem inherently, right? No free lunches. All divination is seeking to explore the client's situation as a locus of influences and proclivities. It's mapping identities and inertias, these dynamic patterns of enervating and retarding capabilities. Right? Its horary charts, especially, are doing things in time and space. We're grounding the cosmic, and I like this Michael McDonald quote about this, that individual experiences and social actions resonate on several planes of existence at once. This is really, really useful. Divination and magic are super interrelated. Diviners are also doing magic historically. Most obviously, we can do divination about the best magic to do, but also you can use divination tools in your magic as well. And here's where that relation starts to happen in some very funny ways. Geomantic ritual itself is based on this notion of trying to allure the ideas of a thing. Ideas in the mind of God is what Hayden's talking about here. Again, we don't need to get off into the Neoplatonism of that, but he's kind of talking about spirits. The hand of a projector or worker is to be most powerfully moved and directed by the ideas or genii when they ascend and descend, right? So what's moving your hand here very clearly is spirits, right? This is not just random numbers, is the idea. When these spirits aren't just present in what's moving your hand, they're also present in the earth themselves answering back as you mark it. All right. The very first thing that John Hayden says after 100 pages of paratext of all of his mates telling him how great he is, and you, the reader, he says that God, this is the very first line, God, the creator of all things, out of the chaos, which was the bodies of wicked angels, made the earth and then divided it into these reified ontological taxonomies of the 4 elements, the 7 planets, the 12 zodiacal signs, the 12 houses of the heavens, and indeed the 16 figures. All right. For him, the divination, the stuff past, present, to come, is almost an afterthought. This is a chthonic angelology. And this seed of the stars is buried there. I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try and wrap this up. In the prayer of the gnomes, where you pray to the god of the gnomes, it's said that this god hideth beneath the earth in the kingdom of gems, the marvelous seed of the stars, right? It's an established part of this occult philosophy that the sublunary realm is already imbued with occult virtue. Much, not all, but much astrological magic is all about capturing the celestial geometry of that particular, of when the stars are right, that particular Neoplatonic emanation can come down and we can gather it like the fruit naturally arising from a fruit tree. And we can hold our bowls up and we can gather it and we can make jam so that we can get at that fruit of the stars all year round. That's the idea. In contrast, geomancy seems to awaken, cultivate, and unleash terrestrial astrological magics via these grammars and maybe even these grimoires of its natural magic. When we mark the surface of the earth to draw forth wisdom and medicines, what are we doing? Are we puncturing something that something's coming back out? We're waking stuff up again. This is the Agrippa's mustard seed principle, right? That things already have occult virtue in them, but we have to remind them, we have to awaken them, we have to connect them back up, remind them what they can do and how powerful they are. The planetary landscape is a great way of interacting with this stuff. So many astrological handbooks have tables of correspondence that include locations that planet rules. This is for finding lost property usually, right? If Venus is in a prominent place in the chart, then it's probably been left in a garden or outside a dance school or outside a brothel. But the earth points back from these places, and occult virtue can be cultivated here to do sorcery as well as divination, and can be used to do ecological sorcery, I would argue, right? So here's the example that Agrippa gives of, if you want to make a love talisman, bury it in a Venusian place, right? The planet of love. The example he gives is a stew house, which is a fancy word for a brothel. And he says it will contract a venereal quality. He's not being base or scatological here. A Venusian quality is what he's talking about. Because things left exposed to other things will take on the qualities of those things. And he specifically says the 4 corners of the earth also pertain to this matter. All right, so again, these aren't just lists of correspondences that tell us, oh, Mars is concerned with places where fire transforms things or where violence transforms or severs things, right? No, it's also telling us that the planet isn't just informing us about the place is informing us about the planet. And again, thinking about these places as instantiations of the planet, not just things that the planet is pointing at, is really helpful here and helps us, again, deal with this model of dealing with the world as it is. Being the planetary spirit we wish to see in the world by haunting these locations ourselves, we can gather our materials in those planetary locales, right? This is about the tangible origins and life of your materials, not just ordering them off the internet. This is about the spirit relationships that you can develop when you start burying things or talking to those plants themselves using geomancy. And again, gives you a derive and an adventure and a set of peripatetic augury of what happens to you on the way there and what happens to you on the way back. All right, getting out of your spirit room and working in the world. You can deploy things in that locale, whether that's charging them like Agrippa's love talisman or sending things out to work there. You can work in that locale. You can go and make your talismans there or burn your candle there or do the things as you're aligned in that power spot, right? You're working in sympathia with that spirit, with that space and its spirits. There are many examples of this. The Picatrix talks about dressing up like someone that the planet likes, dressing up like a soldier if you're doing martial work, or like a teacher, or like a scribe if you're doing mercurial work. Then finally, there's working that locale. There's actually putting the locale to work, visiting and working there as part of an operational remediation. So I've had clients before now where the reading has suggested that in order to win their court case, they should go and process around the courthouse 4 times, a Jupiterian number. That working in these places is part of working with the planet. And the sense of this I get is that we can hopefully get at this kind of grassroots spiritual ecology here, not just building blocks of reality, but patterns of natural processes and interrelationalities of magical nature, not simply appeal to these Empyrean idealist essences, but dynamic relationships which arise in and as even the sublunary parts of this naturally magical cosmos. I'd argue that geomancy gives us a language, or at least a grammar, to explore this natural magic. For me, it puts me in mind of almost of Deleuze's Body Without Organs, this sense of these rhizomatic, sleeping seeds of the stars in the earth that we can wake up and make, and not have to wait for the stars to be right. But geomancers work with what we have now under our feet, right? Work with the very ground of being. These things under our feet are porously leaking their activating influences. They're responsive to up and down regulation, to draw and direct their influence and effect into objects like materia and into events like making things happen in the world. They're capable of connecting networks of empowering and empowered instantiations of the planet and the figures' effects in the landscape, whether we're talking about formularies of materia magica or the rituals and conjurations of immateria magica. Conjuration meaning to swear together that we are collaborating in some sense with these other earthly spirits. So, conclusions. Again, I've run on a little bit, so I'll try and keep this brief. Nature's dynamic humoral equilibrium and imbalances are very well mapped in geomancy. We are utilizing, again, these hinges of sympathy and antipathy. I think of this planetary geomancy in the sense that each of the planets has two geomantic figures, and I think about those as like the feet of the planet on the earth, or the hands of the planet in the earth doing things, right? And in that sense, geomancy, and especially this geomantic magic I'm talking about, is kind of a foot track magic of the wandering ones, the planetes, right? The wandering stars, as they wander across human time and space, right? How we gather their foot track to do stuff with them. What I want to point out is that we don't just have to rely on emanationist, heavenly, top-down models that issue these imperatives of we have to wait till the right time and we have to appeal to some idealist realm beyond the here and now. Rather, I would propose, or as well, I would propose we can also deal with this sense of geomancy mapping, managing and manipulating this rhizomatic networking of an invirtued ground, right? And an inspirited world, not just a world with spirits in it, but a world made of spirits. And ultimately, we're tracing this terroir of consciousness through this interrelation of self and environment, I would argue, and not just human consciousness. Finally, I just want to say that hopefully this is towards, I'm banging on about not just emanationism, because for me, a good, effective, healthy, ethical magic can't just be an escapism. It can't be an escapism, frankly, whether to our own heads or to some idealist, perfect Empyrean realm. It has to engage in the here and now. And yeah, to front a little bit at the end, I don't want your revolution if my souls and bones can't swing dance here amongst the gnomes and trees and dirts and joy and anxiety and fire and night and scissors. And so I pray that we all, through this conference and through these conversations, get at what helps us to be magically embodied and to be magically present. Thank you very much. These are a couple images of my work. I'm happy to talk about a little more if we're interested in doing that. And I'm very much looking forward to the live panel. And I thank you for letting me go a little bit over time. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, everyone.